Welcome back to Good Distinctions. I'm your host, Will Wright, and joining me today is Phillip Campbell, author of the new book, In Pursuit of Wisdom, Catholicism and Science Through the Ages from Our Sunday Visitor Press. Phillip, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Will.
It's wonderful to have you. If you could, just to start out, as I do with all my guests, if you could just introduce yourself to us.
Sure. Well, I'm a Catholic author and educator. I've been teaching for 15 years, high school history and social studies for Homeschool Connections, which is an online Catholic curriculum provider, homeschoolconnections.com, if anybody wants to check it out. And I also have been writing books in the field of Catholic history for many years now. I'm most known for the Story of Civilization series from TAN, which is a series of history texts for elementary and middle schoolers. But every now and then I get fortunate and I get able to write a nice, rich, in-depth trade book on a subject I'm passionate about, like In Pursuit of Wisdom. So basically, I kind of live my life in the field of Catholic history, both for young people and adults.
Awesome. Oh, and I think I mentioned this. We've never met in person, but I also am a Catholic high school history teacher. I teach history and religion, and I am thrilled about your book. In fact, after I read it, I emailed you and said I wanted to try to get several copies and make it a textbook for my class. It goes through a lot of the content that I do with my sophomores as we're looking through the Renaissance and forward. And faith and reason is obviously a huge theme. I mean, This is something that comes up quite a bit. You say something fairly early on in the introduction. I'd like to read it as a way to begin. You say, how does the church respond? Catholics today are repeatedly told by the church that there's no real conflict between science and religion. If that is the case, then the church is somehow suffering astonishing losses in a battle that doesn't exist. While it's certainly true that there can be no ultimate contradiction between faith and reason, merely repeating this mantra has not solved the crisis for millions of Catholics.
Yeah.
And that's something that I definitely would echo. My students are grappling with this as well. And so by way of sort of beginning the questions, I wanted to read that, get your immediate thoughts on that, and then sort of ask the question in this way. If there's a bookshelf in front of us, where does your book fit in? What authors are you next to?
Oh my gosh. That's a big question. It's funny because I have my book on my bookshelf and I just stick it in with the early modern history books. But, I would put it in the same tradition of historians like Christopher Dawson of the early 20th century, who was another Catholic historian who was trying to write in such a way to demonstrate the synthesis between faith and everything that science has revealed to us about the world. It's not an apologetical book. If you've read it, you know that. I mean, there's some elements of historical apologetics, but really it's trying to clarify the historical relationship between the scientific world and Catholicism as a religion. So it's kind of like a broad cultural history text that focuses on the Catholic Church. That quote that you gave really sets up the whole book very well, because one thing I wanted to get at when I wrote this book, I guess the gap I wanted to fill when I wrote this book, was that I noticed that there's still a massive breakdown when it comes to the interaction between science and the church in terms of how people perceive these things. I give a lot of statistics in the opening of the book that suggest that the main reason that young people leave the church, not even one of the reasons, but the highest self-reported reason, is perceived conflicts between science and religion, which tells me that whatever our pastors and our theologians and our speakers are saying about the church and science isn't landing with people. And I think that's because it's taken on kind of a mantra, and people aren't really digging into the specifics of it. The book is very in-depth. It goes through the nitty-gritty on a lot of things, and I think that's to some degree necessary. And if I can give a brief anecdote, I think what set me off on this was years ago, I saw a debate between the late Cardinal Pell and Richard Dawkins. And Richard Dawkins was saying that well, Christianity can't be true because the Garden of Eden story is nonsense. It's completely mythical. And Cardinal Pell kind of just accepted that. He was like, well, yeah, we don't have to take it literally. There's symbolic, blah 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 blah, and he was kind of saying there's no real contradiction. Mm-mm-mm. And then Richard Dawkins comes back and he says, if this isn't real, then where did original sin come from? Because in your own theology, original sin is the result of a literal fall. So what's your explanation for that? And Cardinal Pell was kind of dumbfounded. He's a very insightful, brilliant man, but he didn't have an answer for it. He looked like someone punched him in the stomach and took the wind out of him. And I, as a Catholic, I found myself saying, yeah, Dawkins got the better of that exchange, because Cardinal Pell was saying, oh, there's no contradiction, no contradiction. Well, explain how there's not. Like, if you have this point here where there seems to be an issue, then delve into it and show me why there's not a contradiction. Don't just tell me there isn't and paper over it and move on. And so I wanted to avoid that sort of approach by actually getting into the mud and going through the history of the science and the church and kind of trying to get to the bottom of this.
Well, and I think you do a fantastic job of that. And I say that as someone who absolutely loves the Catholic faith. I mean, I'm getting a doctorate in theology. I have a lived affinity with the faith. I practice, as we all do. I try my best, but also as someone historically minded, and especially here on Good Distinctions, I mean, I often say our tagline is "Good Distinctions are the spice of life," and the book is chock-a-block full of these good distinctions, because
Thank you.
Well, and I'm guilty of this too. I've done what Cardinal Pell has done in the past, where, like I'll say in class, for example, well, there's no actual conflict between science and faith because, Gregor Mendel, the father of genetics, Father Georges Lemaitre, the Big Bang Theory, all these different people who are Catholic, and you go to great lengths throughout the book, not just in a single section, but all throughout, to say that's not proof that the faith is actually science oriented. That's just happenstance, or maybe something stronger, but we need to get into the details. We need to find the clarity, because one of my students, as I did this, and I kind of got the wind knocked out of me as well. I had just said that, and then one of my students raises his hand, and I'm like, yeah, what's up? And he says, isn't Joe Biden Catholic? I said, how? Okay, well, all right. Well, my entire argument dismantled. Thank you. And then we had to go into the nitty gritty a bit more. But how is Christianity fundamentally science oriented? I mean, obviously, you go into great detail in the book, but just in broad strokes.
Yeah, in broad strokes, one thing I argue in the book is that Christianity is fundamentally science oriented, and this is for several reasons. It's really because of well, if I could just sum it up, it's because of the cosmology that it inherits from the Old Testament, which is that, number one, God is a creator God who is outside of nature. He's not part of nature. He's not a pantheistic deity. He doesn't come after nature, which in many of the pagan myths, the gods actually come out of nature. But the Christian God stands before and outside of nature and creates, and nature reflects his own rationality. It reflects his own wisdom. And the Old Testament makes this manifestly clear. And it even says in many places that part of the vocation of the human person is to seek out and learn the wisdom that God has imparted into the world. Wisdom isn't just about ethical behavior. If you read the Old Testament texts and also many of the church and medieval fathers, wisdom is about, as it says in the Old Testament, understanding, like when Solomon in Ecclesiastes talks about why he's wise, he says, I was given knowledge of the seasons, of the movements of the stars, of the mysteries of the earth. He's been given scientific wisdom, and it's part of the glory of mankind to seek these things out and find them. And so, because, as it says in the book of wisdom and also in the book of Romans, these things reflect God. So when we understand the world, we see the face of God more clearly. It's like going to a museum and looking at a canvas and paying attention to the brush strokes and the paint selection and the themes, and you get to know the artist through looking at his work. So God actually reveals himself in a certain sense through this creation, And the more we probe its mysteries, the more we understand that creator. There's a fundamental scientific orientation here. Now, God is always going to be mysterious. There's an infinite gap between God and humanity. But this, in a sense, helps us bridge that gap by continuously marveling at his wisdom and his power. And this isn't something that I'm projecting into the text. I mean, the whole first chapter of the book goes through all the biblical passages. And then the church fathers reflect this as well, where they will say that, some will even go so far as to say that to be Christian is to be properly educated about these things because of this very fact. Like, you want to understand God, then you need to understand how the world functions to know the God who created it. So Christianity, right off the bat, it has a certain rationality to it that you don't find in the pagan religions, and you also don't even find in something like Islam, even though Islam obviously made great contributions to science. But in terms of the overall orientation of the religion, it's not circumstantial or incidental that the scientific revolution broke out in the Christian West and not somewhere else.
One of the things you brought up about Islam that I found fascinating that I hadn't actually dove into in any real way was the one strain of Islamic thought that had, Allah allowing certain things to happen in a certain sequence, but it's always his action. It's not like, I light this thing on fire. It's not that. It's no, I've struck a match.
Yeah.
And I'm kind of paraphrasing it here, but I've struck a match and it's now on fire because Allah said so. It's not like there's no sort of causal relationship in this certain Islamic thought. So it's so interesting kind of juxtaposing that with the Christian worldview.
That's something that so in Christianity, God creates the world according to fundamental principles of order that he inscribes in the nature of things themselves. But Muslims will elevate the will of Allah to the point where they'll say that Allah is not bound in any sense. Like, Allah can't create a order that has to function a certain way because that would bind him. And so this gave the problem of like, well, why do things happen according to predictable rules in nature? And the school you're mentioning is the school of Al-Ghazali, where he says, well, there are no actual laws of nature. Like you said, when we light something on fire, there's no like cause and effect. It's just an illusion. What happens, I go to light the fire and Allah lights the fire directly. And he just does this repeatedly because he wants us to experience regularity for our own benefit, but there's no actual cause and effect. So that's what I mean when I say that Christianity has a sign. I mean, you can kind of make do on that philosophy, I guess, but that's not a fundamentally scientific mindset. Like, well, there's no causal reason for these things to happen. Allah's just doing them.
Well, and like anything in science and any sort of notion of development, there's also an idea of maintaining what we know and going back to the drawing board in a certain sense when we come up with new observations, new data points. You have an entire chapter in the book on monasticism, for example, and it was really fascinating to see how the daily life and workings of the monks in the monasteries led to development. But I think that also flows out of this fundamentally science-oriented approach, is that there's this certain regularity, which is real. It's something that we've seen. It creates these theories that have to be maintained and come back to them over and over, see how everything sort of fits together. So how would you characterize sort of historically the development of science as a pursuit as it relates to the monastics?
Yeah, well, an astonishing amount of scientific advancements in the Middle Ages came out of the monasteries. And to some degree, this is because the monks were like the educated class, right? So they're the ones that have access to academic treatises and whatnot. But I think it goes deeper than that. In the book, I link it strongly to the rule of Saint Benedict and the division of time and labor in the monastery. The monk is someone who is always... Hold on a second. There's kids about to walk in. We're going to have to make a note there, and I'm going to start that comment again.
Okay.
Hey, guys. Oh, it got messed up. No, I don't. Is it just you two? Okay. No, he told me about it. I'm doing an interview right now, so you guys just be quiet and kind of go upstairs or something. Yeah, yeah, I'll take care of it. Okay, I'm gonna start. You said about the monasteries, so I'm gonna start from there and answer that. Okay. So yeah, an astonishing amount of scientific development came out of the monasteries, and to some degree, this is just because the monks were the educated class and they had access to all the manuscripts and the academic material. But I think it goes beyond that. I think it has to do with the lifestyle of the monks themselves, because, like the rule of Saint Benedict, because you find that all the monastic advances are eminently practical. There are things like, oh, we figured out how to cultivate more resilient strains of wheat. Oh, we invented the mechanical clock to tell time better. There are all these the water wheel is a major one, so we can grind wheat without having to do it ourselves. They're eminently practical, and that's because the monks were extraordinarily under the pressure of the clock. Not before it was invented, but the metaphorical clock. Because the rule of St. Benedict divides their day up, right? It says you're going to spend so much time praying, so much time working, and so much time studying and sleeping. And he tells you when you got to do the prayers and everything. But the problem is that if they're going to be self-sufficient in a rural setting, that isn't conducive to having a very fixed schedule, right? And I say in the book, like, the rule of St. Benedict might say you have to pray at 12 o'clock, but what are you going to do when it's 12 o'clock and the pen breaks and all the pigs escape? Or when the cow starts calving and you got to go deal with that, right? There's all these problems in the agricultural life that make you pressed for time, that make it more difficult to keep a schedule. And I think this created a labor incentive for the monks to find labor-saving devices and find labor-saving method. Like, oh, what if we could harness the power of this river to grind our wheat for us, so that we didn't have to attend to that constantly? We're all filtering into the church at different times for the office. What if we had a device that told us all what time to be here so we could plan our day better? I think it was the monastic regimen around the rule of Saint Benedict that created like an incentive for people to have to save labor. And I think this happens to a lesser degree in the medieval world as a whole, because the peasant is also a person who, he's got to like farm his own field. He's got his duties to the church. He's got to turn over a certain amount of crop to his lord. He's got multiple different kind of focuses, and he has to find ways to save time. And that's why it's the medievals that invent things like the moldboard plow, which the Romans didn't have, or harnessing it to the breast harness on the horse. The Romans, for all their ingenuity, their horse harnesses were just a choker around the horse's neck, so the horse would pull from its neck instead of having a padded brace across its chest, which is much better for the horse. It was the medievals that invented the wheelbarrow, for heaven's sakes. Like, the Romans and the Greeks had not discovered the wheelbarrow. They had carts, like with four wheels, but they hadn't discovered the wheelbarrow with a single wheel, which is easier to move than a regular cart. And these are all, again, labor-saving, time-saving devices, right? And I think it has to do with the fractious nature of medieval life. Everybody, and the feudal system, everybody has multiple obligations, either in the monastery, whether you're a peasant, whatever. And this was just kind of the nature that society had. But yeah, I would eminently say that the monastic regimen really prioritized this, and especially given that the monks had the literacy to make these sorts of advance. Like, you have in the 12th century, Elmer of Malmesbury, an Anglo-Saxon monk, invented the hang glider. And he jumped off the top of his monastery with a hang glider and had a successful hang glider flight, because he was curious about the mechanics of the air and flight and whatever. So they were incredibly curious and always tinkering. So I think that's why so many of these developments come out of the monastery. And even later in history, you get like the modern technique of like the first blast furnace was built by the Cistercians in England in the 12th century, that had anything like producing ores on an industrial level. So yeah, there's a lot in the book on that subject, but I think it has to do with the regimens of monastic life.
So their schedule of life allowed for it. The practicality drove the development. There doesn't seem to be as much in terms of lay involvement from the nobles, which I thought was kind of interesting to note. But then as time went forward, you have this sort of explosion of scientific progress, if you want to call it that, during the scientific revolution,
Yeah.
that seems to be coming from a mix of clerics and non-clerics. But it seems like there's at least in the book, you really highlight there's a common thread of sort of this clerical vocation of scientific research. Is that simply because they are more literate and have the time, or do you think there's more to it?
No, I mean that's the baseline of it, but there's more to it. The church, whether in the monastic world or in the diocesan world, what they used to call the secular clergy, there was um, a deliberate push to educate the clergy in scientific matters. The church was considered the custodian of knowledge, of all knowledge, and the church concerned itself with this deeply. So this was part of the training of, I mean, any educated person would have studied astronomy and music and mathematics, but even more so when they got to the university level. And it's pretty astonishing when you start looking at the output of a lot of these people who we think of as theologians, like St. Albert the Great, who wrote all these treatises on optics and on animal biology and all these things. Like I mean, that's why he's called the Doctor Universalis, the universal doctor. Or Saint Bede, the historian of the Anglo-Saxon Church, wrote a scientific treatise, as did Saint Isidore. It was just considered the realm of the clergy because it was a branch of knowledge. See, it used to be called natural philosophy, because philosophy was just kind of like the wisdom of everything you could learn about the world apart from divine revelation, right? And then you had theology, which is like the queen of the sciences, but then what we call science now was natural philosophy. And the church had always concerned itself with philosophical principles. So a lot of that Aristotelian revolution that happens in the 12th and 13th centuries, they weren't just reading his metaphysical stuff. They were reading his entire corpus of works, including all his scientific treatises on motion and physics and things like that. And you found that in the Middle Ages, in the 13th century, especially in England, around Merton College, there was a whole school of thought of people trying to square Aristotle's theories of motion and with what was observed in the world. And it was through these efforts that we got the first Jean Buridan's theory of impetus. Is it impetus or impetus? Impetus? Which is going to be the forerunner of like the modern Newtonian idea of momentum. Mm-hmm. So basically, the issue is that science back then wasn't considered this thing separate from religion. It was kind of like another branch of knowledge. And the way they viewed it was that all knowledge was fundamentally ordered towards God and therefore the domain of the cleric. Theology was like the pinnacle of the pyramid, but everything under that was equally, including music and astronomy, and every aspect of science was considered to be clerical. And that's why when you're moving into the early modern period, especially I think the golden age of this in the 14th and 15th, or 15th, 16th, 17th century, the church kind of considers herself the guardian of scientific knowledge. Now later that's going to change a little bit as due to the printing press, and now regular lay people can devote their time to this as well. And very slowly, starting at the Renaissance, there's going to be like a divorce where science stops being an exclusively clerical endeavor, but it never stops being a clerical endeavor. Like even to this day, science is you still will find Catholic clergy of all stripes who are encouraged to pursue graduate level studies in scientific disciplines. So, yeah, I hope that answers the question. But that's the long and short.
Well, and it's an exceptionally difficult topic because there is such a fracturing that begins in the 1400s, but really sort of explodes in the 1600s. Mm-hmm. I would say in large measure due to all the wars that were fought over religion in the 15th and 1600s.
Yeah.
I mean, I think after the 30 Years' War, especially, people were just sort of done with arguing about religion for a time and actually became very skeptical of it.
Yeah.
Um, and now I think we've come to the point where, man, this is getting a little far afield from the book, but I will tie it back, is, it seems to me that there was this divorce of faith and reason very strongly with the late scientific revolution and then into the Enlightenment.
Yeah.
Sometimes by accident, I would say, like with someone like Descartes, who saw himself as a faithful Catholic, but was certainly not espousing things that were very friendly with the faith, to put it mildly. But then you have others that were completely opposed, like Voltaire.
Yeah.
Um, and then as time progressed, it seems to me like in the last 50 years or so, maybe with postmodernism, we've come to the point where there's this rejection of faith and a rejection of science, leaving us open to basically nihilism. And what I've seen in my own students and with others that are around their age is this embrace of scientism almost as a religion, as a religious endeavor.
Yeah.
And you do talk about scientism in the book. So what is scientism, first of all? And then uh, why is it an issue? And then how does scientism factor into these discussions about faith and reason, and what's the way forward?
Yeah. So scientism is basically a way of thinking where we take one building block of knowledge that is scientific knowledge and we make it the only type of knowledge. Everything has to be explained in scientific terms. And if it can't be empirically verified according to whatever scientific norms, then it's invalid, right? So everything has to be, basically science is the ultimate arbiter of truth. Not just theoretical truth, but even practical truth. You would see this like, I don't know, let's just say hypothetically, if there was a massive public health crisis and we didn't know how to respond to it, and we were being told that we had to do what these scientists were saying because that was the most scientifically, it's kind of like, who cares about the culture, about the popular will, about the sovereignty of, local governments, whatever. We got to just do what the science says.
Yeah, trust the science.
Yeah, it's basically the enshrinement of science to the position of an idol, which is a mistake that the earlier scientists never made, the scientists of the Christian age. So you find that as a consequence of modernity, where there's a radical skepticism about religion, morality. People are looking for an ultimate ground of truth, and many of them find that in science. And so you find today, and I think a lot of the problems with why young people leave the faith is that they might be Catholics, they might be raised as Catholics, but they have a fundamentally scientism saturated view of reality, even if they don't know it, because it's just it's in the air we breathe. It's just imbibed by osmosis, this kind of idolization of science, to the point where they just have those kind of principles by default, right? And I think that's the real issue here. And so, because people are looking for a ground of truth. Now, the issue, though, when you mentioned nihilism, and I have a section on this in the chapter on the Enlightenment. Scientism is not a philosophy that's made to console the human heart, because scientism offers you no reason for anything. It tells you that the universe is more or less a random assemblage of cold atoms, and there's no ultimate meaning. And it makes everything you do meaningless. In the book, I have a fascinating passage from Diderot, who was the atheist compiler of the famous encyclopedia, and he's complaining to his girlfriend that he loves her, but he can't find any scientific explanation for why he loves her. And he's like really troubled by how he knows that in the long run, love must be meaningless. It must be like a chemical reaction in the brain, but his will is reacting against this. And he says, and I'm paraphrasing, he says, like, I curse this blasted idea that my brain can't deny, but my heart rejects. So it made him miserable. And I think we have a society that's kind of drinking deeply from that fount of nihilism, because if scientism is the the philosophy, then scientism doesn't offer us any sort of teleology for the world. It doesn't offer us a rationale for why we should do anything. It's completely materialist, and that's just depressing. And the human person needs some sort of rationale, some sort of metaphysical reason for existence beyond just staying alive for one more day, right? So I think that's something that's severely crippling our culture and our young people. So if you're educating, children in these like science or history or religion, I think it's important to not just jump right into, well, let's talk about, reconciling these problems. Let's start with the broad picture here and talk about how we know anything that we know and what are the types of knowledge, kind of go back to that and kind of restore science to its proper place as a building block of knowledge, but not the primary way we know things, or even the most important way.
In chapter 1, you put it very succinctly and beautifully. Natural science and divine knowledge reinforce each other. There's this reciprocal nature of the two where we do see this fullness of knowledge because all truth comes from God. One of the things I share with my students that always resonates with them is a quote from Heisenberg. And I'm paraphrasing it, but he said, the first sip from the glass of the natural sciences makes one an atheist. But if you keep drinking, you find God waiting for you at the bottom of the glass. And I love it.
There's a similar quote like that from Thomas Hobbes, the 16th century English empiricist, who says, "Too little philosophy inclines one to unbelief. A great deal of philosophy inclines one to religion." It's the same idea. But I would say also, the sundering between faith and reason, it isn't the only separation we see in modernity. Basically, the Christian world was very adept at holding many contradictories in tension. So not just faith and reason, church and state, law and grace, faith and works, all these, or even like hierarchy and equality, which were held together in the medieval church, all these different like kind of opposites that have centrifugal forces were held together in this beautiful web of harmony. But what you find towards the end of the Middle Ages is the dissolution, like, well, I want to have faith or reason, church or state, law or grace, freedom or determinism, and people kind of choose and they break apart the harmonious web. It's kind of what G.K. Chesterton says, where every heresy is where someone takes one little block of the truth and runs with it and exaggerates it, because right. People got sick of holding these things in tension, right? Holding them together. But I do think that there's hope for all this, even though the culture seems to be going off the deep end in many respects. I think that there is an awakening of people who are seeing the fruits of this, who are seeing how nihilistic things have become. And I see across the spectrum, even from people who aren't religious, an increasing appreciation for the society that Christendom created. You probably know, I mentioned Richard Dawkins earlier. There was an interview he gave just this year where he lamented that Islam was taking over England, and then he said that he was a cultural Christian. And what he was basically meaning by that is he didn't realize when he was attacking Christianity that Christianity was kind of like the immune system of the West, and it held together the particular Western way of life that he knew from his childhood, things that he just kind of took for granted. And he believed that if you could just erase Christianity, we could keep on enjoying the world that Christianity built. But now he's seeing that that's not the case. And I'm not saying he's, come to faith or anything, but he's recognized that the world that Christianity meticulously erected over 2 millennia was something very, very special. And that if you dismantle that, you're going to lose that. And so I see a lot of people now increasingly recognizing the value of what Christianity and the Catholic Church have done, and maybe trying to reconstitute some sort of semblance of harmony again.
Well, it seems that the Catholic approach is the correct one from a purely a just paying attention standpoint. I mean, this is something I struggled with when I was in high school and early college was, okay, I was baptized Anglican.
Yep.
We became Catholic when I was 5. I was raised Catholic, more or less. Um, didn't know a lot about what the church actually taught, but I did go to Catholic school for 9 years.
Sure.
And then I started really diving into these things and saying, okay, is Catholicism true? Like, I have to answer this question. I can't just continue being Catholic because my parents are Catholic.
Right.
And so as I started questioning all of these different things, it led me back to something that Chesterton said, there's 1,000 reasons why I'm Catholic, and it all boils down to one, that it's true. But I think what the truth that I found so intriguing and really the medicine for culture is the both and approach rather than the either or. Like you were saying, with faith and reason being split, church and state, nature or law and grace, all these different things that are being bifurcated, they need to be held in a fruitful tension.
They do.
I mean, you even mentioned in the book that there's this strange relationship in the Middle Ages between faith and superstition, right? That we can go off the deep end. Even within these things, there's sort of, we have to avoid the extremes, but by finding that middle ground, by finding that fruitful tension of virtue, it holds all of the, and honest, what I'm talking about, of course, is Jesus. It's the truth,
Yep.
the Word made flesh. But even from a historical standpoint, I can see why Dawkins and others are finally recognizing that something's missing, because it seems like everyone's missing a large piece of the pie, until they realize that you can have the both and. I don't know of any other religion that says both and.
Right. And towards the end of the book, I talk about John Paul II and his observation that in modernity, we have replaced the concept of nature as a mother with just raw matter. And John Paul uses a pun on the Latin mater versus matter. Mother Nature, it's kind of a holistic reality, right? That has to be taken in all its parts. Almost like you would have to take a person in all their parts. Like I can be happy, I can be sad, I can be angry, and you have to, if you're going to accept me, you have to accept all those aspects of my character. And if we look at nature, there's lots of different facets of nature that have to be kind of taken as a holistic, a whole, right? What we would call an economy or an ecology, right? But what happens with modernity is we get to where we view nature as no more than its constituent parts. And that's the fundamentally materialist view, right? A thing is what it's made out of. And if I need the stuff that it's made out of, I can break it down. I can extract the resources that I need, and I can use them somewhere else. And we start to see people that way too, right? It doesn't matter what culture you grew up in, what your religion is. We can import our government to your country and it'll work fine. We can take people from this part of the world, move them to this part of the world. We can shove you in a Amazon warehouse and make you work for 12 hours a day in these mechanistic conditions, and you'll be fine. There's no sense of the whole, right? Of the economy of nature. And I think what people are looking for is they're wanting to reconnect. They're wanting to plug back into the whole and not be treated as mere like data points to be just manipulated.
It's immediately what I thought of. I don't know if you've had a chance to see it yet, but the newest encyclical from Pope Francis, De Lexit Nos, he's talking about the Sacred Heart. And I was reading it the other day, and this passage came to mind. He said, he's talking about the core of the person, the heart, and how it's more than just, like you're saying, the constituent parts, that we have to look at the whole of the person, body and soul, and even more than just those two parts, but this whole being. And he says all these little things, ordinary in themselves, yet extraordinary for us, talking about, soccer being played or worms collected in a shoebox, flowers pressed into the pages of a book. He said they can never be captured by algorithms because we're far more than these constituent parts and data points.
Right.
And so I wanted to share that because I thought, man, that speaks exactly to what you're saying.
I did not read it yet, but that's fantastic. That's a wonderful insight, and I think that's So a lot of people are getting at and I know we're running up against time here, so I'll keep it short, but when we move into the scientific revolution, we get the philosophers and the progressives and the Enlightenment who basically tell us, look, if we enthrone science, there's no limit to the future possibilities of the human race. Of course, then we get, nuclear bombs and online pornography and all that sort of stuff. But, but also the blessing of like material abundance, right? And now people are getting to the point where, like, what is going on in the world? Nobody's happy. Like, nobody's happy with the gadgets we have. Like, who cares that I can, download something at 2,000 megabits a minute? Everybody's isolated. They're saying, 30% of women will still be unmarried by the time they're 30. There's an astonishing amount of men who say they don't have a single friend. Everybody's lonely. Everybody's isolated. What we've done to matter, what we've done to nature, has turned on ourselves. And what we've done to, how we've chosen to view the natural world is basically what we're doing to our society: atomization, fragmentation, isolation, right? And people are, I think, they're starting to identify it. They're starting to realize that no, science isn't going to answer all your problems, and materialism, isn't going to make you happy. So people are looking for authenticity. But at any rate, yeah. So buy the book.
Well, and I mean, you're completely right. And loneliness, this epidemic of loneliness is very much felt by a great number of the students I teach, even though they spend time with people every day. There's this isolation. And to be fair, we are speaking over the internet using amazing technology to do so, which I didn't even think would have been possible 10 years ago. So
yeah,
there's always good things and bad things. And it's what do we do with it? How do we keep the person at the center without trying to conquest nature, but instead to receive it, to, as you say throughout the book so beautifully, to drink in what God is revealing about himself through the world around us. And so, I mean, it should be something where we embrace all of the wonderful things that are happening, because there's a lot of great things that are being discovered and innovated and developed. But it can never be at the expense of genuine human interaction. It can be never at the expense of the person.
right.
And I think that you do a very good job in the book of finding that line, that thread, if you will, throughout history, of showing this is how we pursue wisdom. It's how we've always done so. And I would venture to guess that because God doesn't change things arbitrarily on us, this is what it's going to be 1,000 years from now.
Yeah, and the challenge will be, as you said, how do we keep doing that in our new circumstances?
Well, there's a lot to think through. For those listening, I definitely recommend buying In Pursuit of Wisdom, Catholicism and Science Through the Ages by Phillip Campbell from OSV. Phillip, thanks so much for coming on. Thanks for this conversation. Any parting word?
Just that I would encourage everybody to persevere in study and in prayer and in taking that holistic approach to the world and to our lives that God wants us to have, and to remember to keep things in the proper hierarchy, to seek first the kingdom of God, and then everything else is added on to it. So thank you very much for having me, Will.
Amen. Couldn't agree more. Thanks so much, Phillip.